Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for turning out. First of all, I want to thank Nathan who asked me to do this presentation back in the pre-COVID days, which seems like a long time ago. But the delay did allow me to add and refine to this presentation. So, sorry? Do you need notes? I think I know. So how do I signal you to? Just signal you or? Yeah, okay, so we'll begin. Dan, can you just a little bit that way? Okay. All right. Now I just want to explain, this is not going to be a blow-by-blow history of Wildfield. It's based on slides and pictures I could get and which I thought were important, manageable length. I am going to be touching on a couple of important but almost forgotten events, but I suspect people I grew up in Wildfield don't know about it. And I will beg your indulgence right from the start, because I'm going to be talking somewhat in depth of three members of the O'Reilly family, including a distant ancestor and an aunt who I was quite fond of. When I explain to you what they did, I think you will agree that they do deserve to be profiled. Although it wasn't timed this way, or wasn't planned this way, the timing of this presentation is very appropriate because it was just about a year ago today, or maybe yesterday, that Father Vito, the very popular pastor of St. Patrick's Church, passed away. And Father Vito was the driving force behind a number of different projects, such as the planning and fundraising for a new church. He encouraged the congregation in Wildfield to sponsor and integrate a Syrian refugee family. He made outreaches to different ethnic and cultural groups that, quite frankly, had been pushed aside by the previous priest. And he also promoted the legacy of the legendary Father Francis McSpirit. And I'll be talking about Father Francis McSpirit in a couple of minutes. So just a couple of facts, just in case anybody new to this area. Wildfield is basically centered at the intersection of Mayfield and Gore Roads. It's the home of St. Patrick's Church, the second oldest church in the Archdiocese of Toronto, and possibly the first church named after St. Patrick. It's the home of St. Patrick's School, the first Catholic school in Peel County, now region, and the only one till after the Second World War. It's the home of the Marysfield Cooperative Subdivision, which I'll be talking about, and it's the last intact, for now, hamlet of the old Toronto Gore Township. I've included this map. I didn't do it just for the benefit of people to know that there are a number of different historic sites within a very close proximity of Wildfield. So number one, I think everybody can see that, is St. Patrick's. Number 4 at Ebenezer and the Gore Road is the, okay, get my little, oh, here it is, and the little cursor light. So number 4 right there at Ebenezer and the Gore Road is the Ebenezer Chapel, a former Methodist, then United Church, probably built in the 1850s, now a private rental hall operated by the Ebenezer Toronto Gore Historical Foundation. Nathan's going to be their guest speaker next month. At number 3, that's the Air Canada Flight 621 Memorial. If you're not familiar with that Air Canada Flight 621, it crashed in this very location in July of 1970, killed everybody on board. There was about 109 passengers and crew. This memorial garden was created by a group of developers, not the federal government, which I think they should have done that decades ago because they regulate the airline industry, and not the city of Brampton. Unfortunately, there's no signage on Gore Road, so if you want to go take a look at it, you'll have to do a Google search. I've included this map for the benefit of people who may have moved into this area post the introduction of regional government in 1974. What is now East Brampton was the former Toronto Gore Township. At one time, it extended almost down to Eglinton Avenue. At the top was Wildfield. South half was in Toronto Gore Township. North half was in Albion Township. And that political divide still exists. Mayfield Road's the boundary line. The north half is in the town of Calvin, and the south half is in the city of Brampton. Okay. Oh, okay, yeah. This is a photo looking east towards the Gore Road, what is now known as the Gore Road. It was taken sometime between 1907 and 1916. That timeline can be defined fairly accurately because the building in the valley below the church was the 1907 St. Patrick's School. The building behind the church was a rectory, maybe built as early as 1860s. It was demolished in 1916. I don't know why. It looks like a substantial solid structure, and the rectory which replaced it was nowhere near as grand. Okay. There was a major celebration in Wildfield in 1933, probably one of the few bright spots of the Depression. It was the church's centennial. This is an image taken from the Conservator newspaper. It doesn't exist anymore, hasn't existed for decades. They ran a front page article about this celebration. It was apparently a 2-day event. On the Sunday, more of a religious occasion with a number of masses. But then on the Labor Day Monday, a massive field day and picnics. According to this article, 1,000 people attended. It identifies the elderly woman in insert as Mrs. Michael Fitzpatrick, who at the age of 82 was the eldest member of the parish. There are some people I know in the audience who knew the Fitzpatricks. Another story from this centennial is not mentioned in the article, but one of the lifelong residents of the area, at the end of this, on the Monday, he came on horseback. He was portraying the role of Father Edward Gordon, the first priest of St. Patrick's. And the person doing this role was a man by the name of Ed Pendergrass, and some of you would know him. Mr. Pendergrass told me that on that night, on the Labor Day Monday, he stayed with the priest in the rectory because they were afraid that thieves might break in and try to steal all the process from the different ticket sales. Okay. So this is taken almost from the same angle as the photo that I just showed you. I'm saying 1965 because this is the 1907 St. Patrick's School, which had ceased to be a school previously, years previously, but was used for a time as a rental home and also a community center. That was demolished in 1969. The second rectory behind the church, that was demolished in about 1994. So of these three buildings, only the church remains. So unfortunately, demolition is a reoccurring theme in Wildfield. Its history is almost marked by demolition. This was a scenic 1870s building on the west side of Gore Road, right across from the cemetery, kitty corner from the church. The Region Appeal expropriated about 2010 for the purposes of the expansion of the Gore Road. I came up with a plan to try to save it. I contacted the head of a consulting firm that actually works for developers, and I asked him if he would reach out to his clients, see if they were interested in it. I appeared as a delegate to Peel Regional Council and made this pitch. Unfortunately, didn't go anywhere because A, we couldn't find a developer or anyone else that was interested in it, and even we had who would pay the significant moving costs, and it was fairly evident that the Regional Appeal wouldn't have done that. I staged this little protest on the right with a number of concerned citizens. Knew it wouldn't work, but I felt I should try to do something. This whole initiative did generate a lot of publicity, though. It was covered by the Brampton Guardian, the Callan Citizen, the Toronto Star, and even made CBC Radio. Now, it's not a complete loss because the Regional Appeal and the City of Brampton have saved some of the elements of this house. And not this year, but next year, there's going to be a kind of memorial garden, for want of a better term. They're going to use part of the brick wall. They're going to create a silhouette of one of the windows, and they're going to have text about the house and also an adjacent convent. So that is something that to look forward to. Okay. One of the people that lived in this house was Nicholas Harrison. He was a farmer in Toronto Township, but he was also the clerk for the Toronto Township for 50 years, and that's why I've included it, because I don't think he would have made much money doing that. I'm sure he did it out of a sense of civic duty. When he retired from farming and being a clerk and moved to Wildfield, his retirement party was covered on the front page of the Conservative newspaper, and then when he died about 12 years later in 1933, his obituary was covered carried on the front page of the Bolton Enterprise, now the Calvin Enterprise. Okay. So this is the church today. It was built in 1894, close to the footprint of an earlier frame structure. Maybe there was a log structure before that, and it had outgrown the needs of the congregation, so the new structure was built. The architects were a Toronto firm called Post and Holmes, Albert Post and Arthur Williams Holmes. And they had their practice for about 5 years, then it dissolved, and then Arthur Williams Holmes went on his own. There's a biography in what's called the Dictionary of Architects in Canada, 1800 to 1950, and that biography says he was a prodigious and talented architect who devoted most of his active career to the design of buildings for the Roman Catholic Church. That includes St. John the Evangelist on Gore Road in Calvin. I could not find, he practiced in 1940 and lived in 1944, but I could not find a photo of him. And I contacted a number of different sources, the Ontario Association of Architects, the archives of the Archdiocese of Toronto, but came up empty-handed. Okay. So this interior shot of the church, St. Patrick's Church and the cemetery are designated under the Ontario Heritage Act, and I'll tell you how that came to be, and some of you will be familiar with the story. This goes back about 15 years ago. A priest at the time, working in cahoots, and I use that word purposely, with Bell Mobility, had this plan to erect a cell tower right behind this church. You have a heritage church, and you got this ugly 80 to 90 meter cell tower. So I started a campaign. I contacted people I grew up with in Wildfield, hadn't seen or talked to them for 35 years, asked them to send letters to the Archdiocese. A group of us appeared as a delegation to the Brampton Heritage Board, expressed our concerns, they agreed, and asked their staff to conduct a study. That study went in, and the city of Brampton accepted that, and the church was designated. Okay? Thank you. So Arthur Williams Holmes was the architect, but this is the man who had it built, Father Francis McSpirit, with 2 T's. Father Francis McSpirit had been an assistant pastor earlier in the 19th century, came back in the late 1980s, felt there was a need for a new church. Unfortunately, the church bell, which had to be fabricated in France and carried, shipped across the ocean, didn't have its first ringing till the following year in 1895 when he died. There's a lot of stories about Father McSpirit, and you can find them easily on the web. People at the time believed that he was a miracle worker, and I've read accounts that people would come up from Toronto on trains to Kleinburg and either hire a carriage or walk 8 or 9 miles to Wildfield to meet him. And for decades after his death, people would come up to his gravesite and grab handfuls of dirt and believe that it held miracle powers. There has been a bit of a revival of interest in him. Father Francis McSpirit Catholic School was built, I guess, maybe about 10 years ago. Father Vito, who I mentioned earlier, really promoted his legacy. And go to the next slide. Oops. And okay. And I sort of take a little bit of credit for this. This was my project, although I did work with the local cemetery board, and we raised money to have this monument with a plaque. And then it was designated. Just as a side note, and this may be of interest to some people in the audience, this rock and the plaque, that was a project of a Palgrave firm called Allograph. They used to do the park signs for the town of Calvin. They've now gone out of business. I don't know whether people come up anymore and grab handfuls of dirt from the grave site, but they certainly do leave bouquets of flowers, and Father Vito used to have a number of readings there. Okay. So this is something I'm very proud of. This is a major feature of the inside of the church. It's a plaque to Father Eugene O'Reilly. Father Eugene O'Reilly was a farmer in Ireland in the 1830s. His wife died, so he decided to come to Canada, take the perilous voyage by ship with his 9-year-old daughter. And then when he got here, for some reason, he decided to become a priest. We don't know. It's just kind of lost in the mist of times. He was appointed, his first and only parish was St. Patrick's. He landed here in 1837 in the midst of the rebellion of 1837. According to historical reports, he convinced mostly Irish parishioners at the time not to take part, not to take up arms. But the more important legacy of Father O'Reilly was that he was a builder. He pushed the construction of roads in the area. He was instrumental in the construction of St. Cornelius Church in Kelvin, and he married about 400 couples. He initiated the construction of the St. John's Agricultural College, a little bit more on that in a minute. And I want to especially draw your attention to this last paragraph. At considerable risk, assisted migrants fleeing the Irish potato famine in the 1840s and was one of 2 people who helped cholera victims in the area. That's taken directly from the City of Brampton planning report, which led to a park being named in his honor. And I'll be talking about the park and this other person later in the presentation. So there is, in the cemetery, a monument to Father O'Reilly. I wish I knew a little bit more about it. My father never told me anything about it. It was just always there. I have been told by some distant cousins they think it was their grandfather by 1950. When it was put in, it was just this first paragraph. There's a little blurb here about Father O'Reilly. And then about 6 or 7 years ago, myself, my siblings, and a couple cousins added this little blurb. And that's what this tradesperson on the right is doing. He works for an Aurelia firm, and he's one of the few tradespeople in Ontario who specialize in installation and restoration of the old-style lead lettering. There are now new techniques, but we had to have this lead lettering so it would be in design compatibility with the first paragraph. And I don't think you can see back in the audience there, but it's a little description about Father O'Reilly's daughter, Margaret. She married a second cousin of the same last name. Okay, yes, please.
Eugene O'Reilly became a priest after his wife died. His daughter, Margaret, married John O'Reilly, a distant cousin. Margaret, 1825-1908. I think that's 8. John, 1825-1899.
So as Heather mentioned in her remarks, but I didn't have time to thank her, Father Eugene O'Reilly was my great-great-grandfather. That's how it happened. His daughter married somebody with the same last name. When I say this, sometimes I get all these quizzical looks of disbelief, but it's the truth.
David, can I ask you what you said? What kind of lettering was it?
It's lead lettering.
Lead lettering.
Lead lettering. They have to do a stencil and then kind of blast it out with I forget what kind of machine. So it's quite intensive. It was a very expensive project, but we wanted to do that just to preserve this history. So we'll move on to the next slide. So another branch of the O'Reilly family is buried at this monument, not the one I belong to. And one of the people that's buried there is this rather remarkable individual, Father John Lee O'Reilly. He grew up in Wildfield. He was ordained in 1912 in Berlin, and that's Berlin, Ontario, which was later named Kitchener because of all the anti-German sentiment in the First World War. Almost immediately after, he traveled to Rome to study, I guess it was in a theological university. And where the money came from is a bit of a mystery because the story is that his father was killed in sort of maybe a barn-raising accident. He was probably only a year old at the time, and I think his younger brother might have been still in his mother's womb, and the mother eventually had to sell the farm, so maybe that's where the money came from. So, in addition to being a scholar, Father Leo was quite a good photographer, and he took this fascinating album of photos of his travels throughout Europe, and then the following year he went to Holy Land, took pictures of the Dead Sea, took pictures of a camel caravan going through Jerusalem, took pictures of Constantinople, now Istanbul, took pictures of the Sphinx in Egypt. This album was given to me by some distant cousins who were more direct descendants of him, and I kept on to it for a while, and I thought, this has to be in the public realm. So I donated to the archives of the Archdiocese of Toronto, thought about the Peel Archives, and I thought it made more sense because he would have been connected with the Archdiocese of Toronto. I did that before COVID. They finally digitalized it, and it's now online. I'll show you 2 of these pictures in a minute, but I just want to tell you about what the narrative about Father Leo when he came back. He joined the teaching staff of the St. Augustine Seminary. If you don't know where that is, it's in Scarborough, close to Scarborough Bluffs. He was a professor, and eventually he became a vice president. Unfortunately, he died very young of pneumonia Yeah, he was only about 43. And I have newspaper accounts that his body was kind of laying in state in one church, and the funeral was going to be another church. They had a procession of anywhere from 250 to 300 clergymen on this procession. And they would have had to move fast because this was the days before cross-Canada air flight. They would have to come by train. And these newspaper accounts I have also said they had to have motorcycle cops to hold back the mourners so this procession could proceed unhindered. So I want to show you this picture. This is one of the pictures. Actually, Father Beer didn't take it, but that's him right there. This is taken on the steps of what's called the Assumption Monastery of the Assumptionists. I guess it's Assumption Monastery in Jerusalem. So obviously there was some sort of major pilgrimage, major conference that year. These people just didn't bump into each other. I did contact the Archdiocese of Toronto, but they don't know anything about it. So the second photo I'm going to show you, and it's one I think about a lot, and it's this one on the left. Russian pilgrims at the Jordan. So that's the Jordan River. So I guess maybe one of them spoke English. How else would Father Leo know that they are Russian pilgrims? When I look at this photo, they don't look like the Russian nobility to me. They look like maybe working class or middle class people who strive all their life to take this one trip out of Russia, and maybe it was the only trip out of the village. The other thing I think about, this was in 1913. The following year, the First World War broke out. What happened to these Russian pilgrims? Were they killed in the First World War, the Russian Revolution, or the ensuing Civil War? So that's just a bit of a side trip, so we'll return to the history of Wildfield. One of Father O'Reilly's achievements was spearheading the construction of what was known as the St. John's Agricultural College. And it was built in the valley below St. Patrick's Church. Construction started in 1859, was completed in 1861 with a major dedication ceremony that same year. This was a 3-story structure with a dining hall and dormitories that could accommodate 80 orphan boys from Toronto who were to be taught agricultural skills. It was staffed by the Christian Brothers. At the same time, there was a parallel day school for teaching those orphans and also the neighborhood children just basic literary skills. Now, the Christian Brothers left the area in 1875 and the boarding school closed, but the school continued on. This plaque was my project. I raised most of the money of it, although I did get a substantial donation from the Duff and Peel Catholic School Board. I wrote the text, which I think the school board approved. In hindsight, though, I'm not too sure that some of the pertinent details are missing, only because this timeline from when the agricultural school closed till when the 1907 school opened is a bit vague, but it did operate. And there was a thesis, and I didn't realize at the time when I was working on this project, it was about year 2000, there was a thesis written by Rita Adams, who was a principal of St. Patrick's, I guess years later, but she wrote this thesis, I guess in the 1970s, and she names Miss H. Roach as being the first teacher registered by the province in 1883, and there were apparently about 33 students there in that year, 1883. So in my opinion, St. Patrick's School goes back to 1861, and there's been a school operating ever since. So St. Patrick's School the present one, it may not be the oldest school in Peel region, but I think it may be one of the oldest, even though there were 3 different buildings and might have been a different name used at some point. So we're returning back to the 1907 St. Patrick's School. I just really like this illustration. I don't know who did it, or I give them credit. It just seemed to be out in the public realm for quite a long time. This was information provided by a former employee of the Duff and Peel Catholic School Board. The first teacher was Margaret Hayden, who also taught in the old agricultural college building. And the peak of the school enrollment was in 1914 with 28 students, and that would have included my father and a number of his siblings. And one of his sisters taught in this school in the 1920s. However, things started to change after the First World War. There was a population decline. I guess if you weren't the firstborn, you didn't get the farm, you would have had to move into the city and get a job in an office and a factory. So this population decline, it was severe in the 1920s, and it became acute in the 1930s. So by 1940, this was the student body. There were 6 students, and probably the woman in the back is a teacher, must not have been paid much. So there was a number of initiatives by a couple of priests, just during the Second World War and in the immediate post-World War, to entice people to come into the community. So those initiatives including selling some lots off the substantial church property just so to have a population increase. And next slide. Okay. So the next initiative, and I'm sure some of you remember, the real old-timers in the audience will remember this building. It was a store probably built in the 1890s. It was located right at the southwest intersection of what is now Mayfield and Gore Road. The Archdiocese of Toronto purchased this building in 1946, and it became the home of the Loretto Sisters, who were the main teaching body at both the, what I call the old and new St. Patrick's School. Unfortunately, it was demolished in 1969 when Mayfield Road was expanded. The first Mother Superior was my aunt. A little more about her in a minute or two. Next slide. So these efforts to revitalize the community were successful. They were wildly successful, as a matter of fact. And this was a student body in 1949, less than 10 years after the photo I just showed you. There are 2 people in the audience or in this photo. I will ask them to identify themselves at the end of the meeting. So, although this marked a revitalization of Wildfield, now there was a different problem. There wasn't enough space in the 1907 school. Some of the classes had to be held in the convent. So there was a major fundraising drive, a new building for a new St. Patrick's School. I keep calling it new, even though it's now 70 years old, and is still located on the west side of Gore Road, across from the church. The first wing opened in 1950, and this was a procession walking from the church to a dedication ceremony. It might have been the following spring, but there was major guests here, and we'll just move to the next slide, and that was this gentleman, Archbishop James Cardinal McGuigan. He was the guest of honor at this dedication ceremony. And he was in this role for a very long time, from the mid-1930s to the early 1970s. As the caption says, these photos were provided by David Lee Radigan, who's in the audience, who grew up in Wildfield and actually lived in the old 1970 school. After it ceased to be operating as a school, it was rented for a time to her family. And then later, David Lee, she became a teacher, and then later came back to Wildfield and taught at the new St. Patrick's School for several years. Now, all this development, all this immediate post-World War development came before another development which added more people and maybe changed the fabric of the community a little bit. And that was the Marysfield Housing Cooperative. This is Carl and Mary Finley. They were part of the Marysfield Cooperative Subdivision. And they were part of a group of 14 families that bought a substantial amount of land from the Archdiocese, from the church, and built their homes on it. And there were perimeter homes, and then there was an exterior road, and they built the homes around this interior and the exterior. The homes were built based on Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation plans, and the homeowners could have whatever plan they want, but for the actual locations, they drew straws. Now, Marysfield was not a one-off. It was developed under a set of planning and construction and design principles developed and written by what was known as the Institute for Social Action at St. Patrick's College in Ottawa. The driving force behind this development was a Catholic priest by the name of Father, later Bishop Morocco. There was anywhere from 10 to 15, maybe even more of these housing cooperatives built under these principles. The first one was in Ottawa. Just before Marysfield was developed, a couple of the priests from this institute addressed a large crowd in Ottawa and tried to push this idea of a cooperative approach to home building. And that was eventually the impetus for 81 families in the Hamilton area, some of whom, and probably many, living in substandard rental housing. They purchased about 14 acres of land in Grimsby and then later divided into 3 different co-ops. These were the study booklets that the co-op members, including Carl, Mary, and Finley, would study. They would get together each week and they would read them out loud. And they did this for a year. So when they did buy land, they were ready to go. They were ready to construct their homes. One of these, I don't know which one, it says education for excavation. This slide was given to me or presented to me, provided to me by Janet Muse, who's in the audience. And she grew up in the Grimsby Co-op. Her parents were one of the founding members. And she's been quite active in observing the history of that co-op. So we'll just move to the next line. So this is what I call the build, the construction of these homes. Started in the fall of 1954, and by the fall of 1955, they were occupied. So this shows you how well organized this group was. They'd studied, so they were ready to go. And these people were not, there was 1 or 2 tradespeople, but most of them were just ordinary people because they'd studied and were organized and knew what they were doing. As the caption says, these photos were provided by Bill Varley, whose parents were part of the co-op, and his mother is still with us. She lives in Mississauga, I'm assuming, in a senior citizens complex. So move on to the next line. Oops. This is Father Morocco. After these homes were built, he went and visited them. And the Grimsby Co-op people, they were instrumental in getting a park. It was an existing park. They got it renamed after him. So it's right on the shores of Lake Ontario. So unfortunately, there's been some initiatives and petitions by the existing homeowners to sever their lots in Marysfield, and a number of some of their longtime residents in the subdivision tried to fight it. The City of Brampton's Planning Department came up with a set of recommendations to put severe restrictions on these severances, and the council went against them. I think there's a bit of shenanigans there, but it went through. But fortunately, there will be a heritage plaque installed in Marysfield sometime later this year, maybe spring, later this summer. I just want to give you a little bit of background. I also belong to the Brampton Historical Society, and each March, at least they were doing this before COVID, they would invite some heritage planners from the city of Brampton who would kind of give an overview of new policies, new initiatives, what new homes and buildings had been designated. At one of these meetings, I went up to the heritage planners and I said, "Do you know about Marysfield?" And they didn't know anything about it, but they were quite interested. And I said, "Would you be willing to talk to one of the existing homeowners?" And they said, "Yes." So I went and talked to Mr. Finley, and he agreed to meet with them, and they interviewed him quite extensively. He provided a whole material about the development of the subdivision and many of his existing photographs. Now, there has been someone else involved in this, but in getting this plaque, but she came in later in the process, and I really want to stress, especially because I know there's some Wildfield residents in the area, that this probably wouldn't have happened unless Mr. Finley had agreed to be interviewed by these heritage planners. So we'll go to the next slide. So these heritage planners recommended that a street be named after Mr. Finley in Wildfield, and the street is located, on the next slide, called the Vales of Humber. I wish they called the Vales of Wildfield. This is a large development center at Mayfield and Gore Road. Extends all the way down to Countryside and west to McVean. When it was first proposed, and it's probably going back about 15 years, I tried to fight it. At one point, almost screaming at the mayor of Brampton at the time, Susan Fennell, but at a certain point I realized it's going to go through. You're just tilling windmills. So I figured, well, might as well try to get something out of this. So I launched a campaign to have a park named after Father O'Reilly, and I got help from a number of people who sent in letters. I want to thank two of them because they're both in the audience. One is Heather Broadbent, who many of you know. The other lady is Daveline Radigan. And eventually the city of Brampton said, yes, we'll name a park after Father O'Reilly. That went in, and then I pushed for a dedication. The next slide? Oh, okay. So this happened. This dedication was in May of 2017. The man on the very far left is John Spaveri. He was the regional counselor at the time. The area regional counselor, and the man standing beside him was Gurhip Dillon, the area counselor. This was just a wonderful event. I want to give a shout out, I don't think she's in the audience, to the City of Brampton employee who organized this event and did a very good job. Her name is Jessica Sculp, and she lives here in Bolton. Now, stepping back a few years, going back far, well, probably, this is 2017, probably going back to 2012, maybe even 2010, I received a call one day from a representative of the Developers Consortium, and there's more than one developer, and he asked me if I would be willing to submit a list of street names. And apparently it's a very onerous process coming up with the street names, and I think what he told me, and I think this is right, you can't repeat a street name in Peel. If there's already in use in Mississauga, Brampton, you can't use it in Kellam. That's just because of emergency purposes. So anyways, I said yes, and I sat down. I came up with a whole list of names and reasons why these names should be used. I emailed it to him, and at a certain point he got back to me. He only used a handful of those names, but he did promise that the ones he was going to use would be very close to the heart of Wildfield. And that's a promise that he did keep, which is why we have a Leo Austin Road. And Leo Austin Road is, next slide, named after this individual, Father Leo J. Austin. He was a pastor at St. Patrick's for a brief few years, 1949, 1952, but he accomplished quite a bit in that brief period. And he laid the groundwork for the Marysfield subdivision. He was involved in the planning, would have been involved in the planning of the new St. Patrick's School, and he helped co-found a credit union, which lasted for several years, I think well into the 80s. It was eventually acquired by one chain, by another chain, which eventually became part of the Alternative Credit Union. So part of the Wildfield Credit Union is in the part of the DNA of the Alternative Credit Union branch here in Bolton, and many of the members switched over. But now this was just a very short thumbnail sketch of a very illustrious career, because later Father Austin was transferred to Whitby, and he promoted the building of a number of schools, including Whitby's first Roman Catholic high school, Dennis O'Connor. And he was apparently quite popular, as he had been in Wildfield, and when he retired, the town of Whitby declared a Father Austin Day. And his service to the Whitby community was the reason the Father Leo J. Austin Catholic Secondary School was named after him in 1989. So the Father O'Reilly Park is on Leo Austin Road, which in turn connects with Sister O'Reilly Road. This is one of the names I proposed, although I did not make any more effort to promote this than the other names, and I was quite pleasantly surprised when I got a list of the street names in the city of Brampton. Unfortunately, the city of Brampton refused to put the apostrophe in the sign. They gave me some bureaucratic reason why they couldn't do that. Anyways, we'll go to the next slide. So, Sister O'Reilly, or really the name was Sister St. Eugene O'Reilly. She was born in Wildfield. She was my father's sister. She started to become a nun at the age of 19. At 1915, she eventually became a nun. Taught a number of different schools, and then came back in 1946 when Loretto Convent was returned into her community, and she assumed the position of the Mother Superior, being the principal of the old 1907 school, which she attended decades earlier, and then became the first principal of the new and still operating St. Patrick's School. When she died in 1986, she became a nun for almost 71 years. So this was another initiative a few years after the Father O'Reilly Park. I pushed for an official opening of the Sister O'Reilly Road. This is a little more difficult because I had to get the principal on board, although she was on board right from the start, the Loretto Sisters, and another different department of the city of Brampton that really had trouble kind of grasping this concept. But anyways, we pulled it together. This lady right here was the principal. Her name's Norma Rossetti. She's since been transferred. She went really on to town on this. We had the ceremony at the Father O'Reilly Park. She had the choir, school choir, sing O Canada. She had all these superintendents lined up, and then we strode the 5 minutes over to this intersection, had our picture taken. Oh, just back up a little bit. Yeah, and so there are people there. There's some of the teachers, some of the Loretto sisters. There's still a few hands on the left. My brother is there, and his son. So we'll just move on to the next slide. So I want to thank Nathan for restoring this photo in Photoshop. The original's not very good, so that's Sister Riley. My siblings and I just called her Aunt Madeline because, hey, she was our aunt. But now I had a different reason, or actually the main reason for incorporating this photo in the presentation, because I think it may have some historic importance because of who else is in the photograph. Does anyone know who the young woman is? No? I'm going to give you a guess. I'm sure somebody will get this. At least I hope somebody will get this. Lake Ontario, 1954. Marilyn Bell. That's correct. Okay. And so the man, that's Marilyn Bell. The man in the photo is her coach, Gus Ryder. They're all together because Marilyn Bell attended Loretto College School, which was actually high school, where my aunt taught at. She wasn't the principal. She might have been the homeroom teacher. So we have Leo Austin Road, which connects with Sister O'Reilly Road, which connects with Martin Burns Drive, although this is a photo of Martin Burns Drive at Mayfield Road, and this is going to be the site of the new church. Now, there really was a Martin Burns, and there are a handful, or maybe more than a handful of people in the audience who would have known him personally. So move to the next slide. This was a photo his daughter provided. I thought she would have had a better one, but I have to go with this one. So Martin Burns was a member of a multi-generational farm family. His farm was located in the almost now disappeared hamlet of Castlemore in the proximity of the Gore Meadows recreation area. He was very active in the church. His grandfather had a hand in building the church. He was active in the community. He was part of a committee that oversaw the publication of a history book called From This Year Hence, which was a history of Toronto Gore Township, came out in the 1967 centennial. He served on the Township Council as a council for a number of years, and also in 1967, he became Reeve. If there's anybody here from large urban areas have never heard the term Reeve, the Reeve is like the mayor. In smaller, sparsely populated municipalities, they have Reeves, and sometimes there's a deputy Reeves. So because Mr. Burns, and this is him right there, he's a kind of short individual, because he was the Reeve, he also sat on Peel County Council that year. And second from his right is an individual, of course, that many of the Bolton old-timers will immediately recognize. That's Hill Allen. He was the Reeve of the village of Bolton. And then later, from the mid to late 1970s, he represented Bolton, Ward 5 on the New Calvin Council. Allen Drive and Allen School is named after him. Some in the audience may even recognize this person. His name was Jim Archdeacon. He was a deputy reeve of the old town of Brampton, and then became the mayor of the new city of Brampton. So we'll move to the next slide. So I'll just briefly show you this slide. This is a photo story I did with Mr. Burns, who was a priest at the time. Just a few days before the second rectory was demolished, Mr. Burns had seen the first rectory demolished, the construction of this one, and then was witness to its demolition. So we'll go. Within about 8 minutes of all these streets that I've just shown you is a storm management pond, and it's called the Colonel Baldwin Pond. And if you just go to the next line. Oh, next, no. And it's named after this individual, Colonel James Baldwin. So Colonel James Baldwin was an Irishman who served with the British Army in what was called the Peninsular War, and that was the name given to the campaigns the British waged against Napoleon in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. And he's listed in what's called the Canadian Dictionary of Biography. He's written up by an historian called Perkins Bull, and apparently showed quite an amount of bravery on the battlefield, leading charge against one fortress about 3 different times. He was wounded about 4 different times. Eventually, he came to Canada and was able to obtain a 400-acre land grant in Toronto Township, although that wasn't immediately needed or automatic. He had to push for it. And he built this fine estate. I can't even pronounce how that's pronounced. But I did read in one history book. It was basically kind of located near where the International Center in Malton is located. So Colonel Baldwin was quite active in the community. He was a school trustee. He was justice of peace. But there was a number of setbacks. He wanted to run for MP for Peel. He had to withdraw. And he had outfitted this Loyalist regiment during the rebellion of 1837, but he rejected his own unfit the uniforms and equipment that were provided that regiment, and unfortunately he lost the lawsuit and he lost a fair amount of his fortune. But he deserves to be remembered for, in a way, a civic act of bravery that in many ways exceeded his bravery in the battlefield. In the late 1840s, there were a wave of Irish immigrants coming to Canada suffering from cholera and typhus, and they were basically just warehousing what they called these fever sheds on the Toronto waterfront. And according to the historian Perkins Bull, Baldwin went and looked at these fever sheds. He was appalled, and he realized he would have to do something about it. So he and his wife made provisions for their children to move out and stay with neighbors, and then they turned their house into an isolation hospital. And what he did, according to Perkins Bull, is he went down to Toronto more than a few times with a lumber wagon. He would take these sick and dying people to his home, and basically he brought disease and death to his front door. Well, not just to his front door, through the door into the house. And he and his wife looked after him. They had help from only one couple, Thomas and Mary Smythe it was. And he only had one visitor. I just want to get my notes. And I just want to read you something that's taken directly from Perkins Bull's writing. I'm not paraphrasing. This is what Perkins Bull writes. Their only visitor was Father Eugene O'Reilly, who fiercely ministered to the sick, shrove the dying, and buried the dead. So that's something I'm quite proud of. Baldwin's been somewhat, if not largely, forgotten. So it's a good thing that there's at least something to preserve his legacy, even if it is a storm management pond. And I think what he did, trying to tackle an earlier pandemic, has resonance 170, 175 years later in 2023, considering what we've gone through with COVID. Now, I wasn't responsible for the naming of the storm management pond, but I am responsible. This was one of the names that I gave to the developer, and the street name. And this is how Wildfield got its name. There was apparently called a Squire Ellis who lived in what's now Wildfield. At that time, this is going back to the 1890s, the community was named Gribben after a priest, and apparently this Squire Ellis didn't like him, so apparently he went into the graveyard and written down all the names of people who were buried in this cemetery, and then sent a petition and sent it to the provincial government, and the name got changed. Now, there are a number of different stories that he came up with the name Wildfield because it was the family estate in Ireland. Some accounts say it was the family estate in Ireland or England. But I want to show you this, another slide, and this is, we'll just go to the next slide. Slow?
It's not changed here. Oh.
Okay. So I want to thank Nathan for taking this image out of what's called the 1859 map of Canada West. This is what's now Mayfield Road. This is what's now the Gore Road. Squire Ellis's farm was right on the northwest intersection. I don't know if you can see it. His farm, and what became known as Wildfield, was called Wildfield. And maybe if there's time, people can come up and take a look at this. So that's where the name came from. From some of the fragmentary accounts I've seen about the Squire Ellis in the Peel Archives, it doesn't particularly strike me as a nice person, but then history isn't always made by the nicest people, and that's the name that is used, and, well, Wildfield is a much more interesting name than Gribben anyways. So we'll move on to the next slide. So I made a few references to Perkins Bull in my presentation, and I'm sure most people in the Historical Society know who Perkins Bull is, but I suspect there are others in the audience who don't. So Perkins Bull grew up in Peel on a farm. He became a lawyer and a very successful businessman. In the early 1930s, he was injured in a car accident. And as part of his recuperation, he decided to write a number of different histories, and he hired a whole team of researchers, published a number of different books. One was called From Macdonnell to McGuigan. It was published in 1939, so research would have started maybe 4 or 5 years earlier. So there'd still be some people who would have known Father Francis McPherson and would have heard the stories about Father O'Reilly from their parents. And then, of course, he would have had the records, the meticulous records that the Catholic Church maintained. So I don't know if I mentioned the name of the book. The book was called, that he wrote this book on the Catholic Church. It was a history of the Catholic Church in Upper Canada, now Ontario. It was called From Macdonnell to McGuigan. And I just want to tell you about the title, From Macdonnell to McGuigan. Macdonnell is a reference to Alexander Macdonnell, a Scottish immigrant who became the Bishop of Kingston in about 1826. He was, in fact, the first Catholic bishop in Upper Canada. The house that he lived in, it still exists. It's called the Bishop's House, and it forms part of the branch of, or part of one of the branches of the Kingston Library. It was almost demolished in the 1970s. I don't know what people were thinking about back then. But anyways, last year, the city of Kingston conducted this $1 million top-to-bottom restoration, partly to correct some of these lingering issues from the demolition, just general maintenance. It was a case of restoring and tucking the original Kingston limestone, restoring the original sash windows, and putting a new roof on it. So that's Macdonnell. The McGuigan is a reference to Cardinal McGuigan, the Archbishop of Toronto, when this book was published in 1939, and whose photo I showed you earlier in the presentation. I think those of us who really treasure local history owe Perkins Bull a debt of gratitude. There is a plaque to him at PAMA, the Peel Art Gallery, Art Museum, forget the name, PAMA. And there's also a permanent display inside the building. If you haven't been there, it's worth a visit, a nice visit on a Sunday afternoon. That more or less, I've tried to condense this as quickly as possible. We'll open up the questions, but I just want to briefly turn the meeting over to Valerie Mackey, who's going to just give you a brief connection between Father O'Reilly and the history of Bolton, early history of Bolton.
Thank you.